Really excited to have in the museum where I'm sitting tonight. We are also, we're still doing virtual talks, which are great and allow us to have so many more people from around the world. But we are open right now, so please come visit us, make an appointment, and come check out the show in person. Basically, I'd love to tell you a little bit about the museum. I'm Paul Moakley, the caretaker and curator of the museum for any of you who haven't been here before. I'm really excited because actually I'm celebrating kind of 20 years of curating exhibitions here and just working in the community out here in Staten Island where I'm from. It is really unfortunate tonight. Victoria, our executive director, can't be with us. She's a little under the weather. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the museum. The mission of the Alice Austen House Museum is to foster creative expression, explore the personal identity, educate and inspire the public through the photography of Alice Austen and her life and historic home. Over the last couple of years, actually 5 years ago, the Alice Austen House was designated as a landmark of LGBTQ history, along with Stonewall. We were the first two places in the state to be recognized in this way, so we're really excited and happy Pride. Over the past 20 years, I've tried to take the legacy of Alice Austen and her history and connect it to contemporary artists. And the thing that I love the most about this space is you can come here and have a really intimate experience with art inside Alice Austen's actual family home. I'm actually sitting in her bedroom right now where some of Paul's show is installed. And I think it just makes it very different from experiencing art in a commercial gallery or a museum. It's definitely very intimate and relaxing, and of course, beautiful. We're right on the water in the Narrows. The thing that I would say about connecting Paul's work to Alice Austen and the reason for placing it here is the incredible sense of intimacy in Paul's work is something that we were initially drawn to, and something that I've always really loved about his portraiture. And the use of domestic space and these details, and as a theme that constantly kind of come up in Paul's work. To give you a little bit of background about Paul, Paul was born in San Bernardino, California, and is a Los Angeles-based artist. And he now has a new title as the MFA director at the University of California, San Diego in the Visual Arts Department. His work is in collections around the world, including the Getty Museum, the Guggenheim Museum, Hammer, the MoMA, SFMoMA, and the Studio Museum in Harlem, just to name a few. His work has also appeared in many publications like The New Yorker, The New York Times, and one of my favorites, I've always loved that ARTFORUM cover from 2019, which was really beautiful. And if you want to explore Paul's work more in depth, Aperture did sort of a fresh monograph a couple of years ago that went along with a show at CAM St. Louis. And it was a collaboration between Aperture and that space. Paul has been working for many years on his portraiture studies. And I would just say, we really love that there was this connection to Paul's space at his old apartment in Brooklyn, 144 Powers, which this show is named after, and kind of connecting it to to life here. The exhibition includes work made in that space and sort of different iterations up until this point. And I've just always been fascinated sort of how Paul has played with this idea of portraiture and really expanded on that sort of in the artist studio and kind of expanding what that means into these sort of endless possibilities. And without further ado, I'm going to let Paul here just take over and kind of take us through how this work has evolved over the years. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Paul.
Hey, everyone. Thank you, Paul, for the intro and everything. Here, I'm going to do this thing of just spotlighting, so it makes things a little easier in these Zoom rooms. Yeah, thank you again for the intro. So yeah, I'm coming to you all from Los Angeles, where it is lovely, 70 something degrees, a little cloudy, thunderstorms, which is unusual for us, but it's nice. I'm sitting outside in the backyard. Um, okay, here, let me scroll back to a little screen share. Okay. So now you should be able to see. Can y'all see my screen?
Yes, it looks great, Paul.
All good. Okay. So I put together a new set of images. I've done a lot of artist talks. I just did one about recent work for the Henry Art Gallery on Friday. And so, you know, I want to get out of a just kind of like rehashing the same thing over again. I'm gonna touch on how things relate to current work, but I'm not going to be talking about current work. I'm going to be speaking specifically about work from 2005 approximately to about 2014. And so, you know, because that's the focus of this presentation at the Alice Austen House. But also because, you know, I did a handful of artist talks when I was younger, you know, about early work as far back as 2006, I believe, in this thing called Slide Slam at the ICP that Alan Frame organized. And it was a kind of interesting event with like Phyllis Galembo and Lee Ladair and me. It's like you would have never thought the three of us would be presenting work in the same place. But anyways, the connections kind of go very far back. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I've been doing a lot more talks since 2016, 17 onward, but in which I kind of touch on past work and how important it has been for how ideas have formed. But I'm going to take this time to actually just focus on that work. Okay, so, you know, I hope this is of interest. So I'm actually just going to go really fast through some images of recent work just to kind of get a sense of, you know, portraiture, of course, is like is a solid part of the work since the beginning. Here's a 2017 portrait of Anthony, and a 2019 portrait of Zane. But you know, something that you see in these that I kind of want people to sort of pay attention to and looking at the older work or the work that precedes it all is the use of materials, fabric, drapery, how elements of using and reusing fragments, collage, or what is called collage. In fact, none of the photographs are collages, comes into play. The use of fabric and drapery in terms of concealing, revealing. You know, these are a lot of the elements that are in the current work have a much longer history in the process. And it's something that's kind of interesting because, you know, along the way, when I started making, you know, work with this black fabric, with the black velvets, just as one example of many elements, or even just sort of like featuring the tripod, you'll see that that these are things that have migrated and across projects and bodies of work since the beginning, even if it's taken, you know, even if at times they took, you know, a dozen years for them to come to the forefront. Okay, so I'm gonna show a bunch of early portraits here. And I apologize if there's like a little bit of sound of helicopters in the background, but hopefully Zoom kind of filters that out. Okay, so one thing I want to kind of like, I always like to contextualize for the early portraits is the places in which, or the platforms and the spaces in which early work was presented, which coincided with the emergence of things like the notorious Butt magazine, published in Amsterdam by Joop van Bennekom and Gert Jonkers, which was, you know, something that came along at that moment of, you know, I think it began in around 2004, with this explosion of kind of like the beginning emergence of like social media, but also of you know, now, you know, we have the printed matter art book fairs, the whole kind of like zine explosion, you know, third generation zines. So I like to show kind of like a context in which a lot of this early work appeared. Here's a portrait of my friend Jason. We went to undergrad together at NYU. Here's a self-portrait from 2005 that was published in this, I believe this was maybe the second or so feature in Butt magazine. Hopefully many of you have a reference for this period in time. Here is that self-portrait. And here's kind of just like a map. This was a article in New York Magazine, I believe in about 2005 or 6, that was kind of giving a overview of the landscape of all of these sort of like queer art, design, architecture kind of like publications. And in many ways there was, you know, I could draw out, you know, if we were to talk about it, all of the collaborative links between all of these, from Butt to Ridiculous, Pinups, Art Fancy, Pinup, K48, They Shoot Homos, Don't They, Straight to Hell, Spank, etc. But here is this picture, self-portrait with John from 2004. This was made in December 2004. A self-portrait in a sense with my friend John. We had met my freshman year, his sophomore year at NYU. And this I'd kind of considered the first portrait that I made. At a point after having made, you know, all the work I did as a student and kind of starting to think about why I was making portraits or why I was making images of people and thinking about what it meant to make a portrait. And I made this at a moment when I reached out to reconnect with John after we had both been out of school, in this way of kind of like looking out, something that kind of like we began by looking out across friendships and people I'd wanted to get to know, people that I may have dated or had flirtations with, you know, this sort of sense that making photographs would kind of help me understand my, you know, those forming social relationships. If that makes sense. I think maybe a lot of people can relate to portraiture in that way. I believe this is a work that's in the show, Raffi, from 2005. He was a friend. We initially met before I considered myself making portraits, as someone who responded to those, you know, art school bulletin boards of, you know, would you sit for a project in exchange for, you know, some pictures for yourself? But his interest in the work ongoing was one of those things that made me realize that it was a kind of mutual investment in the process that transformed images of people into portraits. You know, here. So anyways, there's a lot of these early ones. So I'm going to kind of go kind of quickly through these just to kind of get a sense of things. Futoshi, for example, was someone who was also working in zines and reached out. I got to know him. He reached out to take a portrait of me, and I took a portrait of him in exchange. And now he's a wonderful, quite successful art book publisher since he's moved back to Japan. So, okay, let's go through these. Woodrow, Colin. It's kind of also just been fun in this process of going back and looking at these works. One thing I want to say is also, I forgot to mention, is all of these images that we're looking at right now were made at 144 Power Street, which is this townhouse in Williamsburg off of the Graham Avenue stop that I moved into with 2 friends from NYU in 2003. And I lived there for the next 11 years to the day. From August 1st, 2003 to August 1st, 2014. And so this is where all of the early, you know, work was situated for the most part. But let me just jump back here because we see this second portrait of David made in 2008. This was actually made in his apartment the day before he left New York to move to Southern California to do his MFA. And the funny thing is he lived right down the street. He was also on Powers Street. I was at Powers and between Graham and Manhattan, and he was at Powers and Humboldt. And many other friends kind of cycled through. We kind of called it Gay Powers. I believe Zoe Leonard came up with that. The lesbians were first. as always, the pioneers. Okay, so let me go through these. Dean, Preston. And one thing I want to point out too, which I'll get to later, is if you notice the ways in which the initial portraits are very kind of like close and cropped. I didn't start off thinking about portraits as in terms of environment. I was starting off wanting to focus, thinking that I could focus through cropping, through this sort of like close-up, what is the word called? Composition, focusing on the subject. But you'll notice that over time, I start to pull back and you start to see the place where these friends are sitting on the horizon of this bed. And that becomes really important later. But we'll kind of get to that. Anyways, there are hundreds of these portraits. By this point, I had been making images of some friends, would sit multiple times. New friends were coming through, and it really became, in a certain sense, kind of like an accidental documentary of a group of this circle, the social circle of friends that I was in at the time. Here's another work that's in the show. This one here was actually made in Pericles' apartment in Queens. So you can see how I'd sort of started to move out of my space. And that was, in a reaction, I think, after a few years of having used the same, I had moved bedrooms at one point in the house, but after a certain time, I had become very familiar with making images in that space, down to, where to set things up, how to set up the lighting, all of these things. And I wanted to challenge myself kind of by going into other people's spaces. Like this portrait of Tim Hall and one of his poodles, Lily, who's since passed away, was made in his parents' home in upstate New York. Tyler here is in that bedroom, my bedroom. Abby here was in his apartment in Manhattan, in the Lower East Side. So that's, I hope, that's a kind of a quick overview of some of these early portraits. And then I kind of want to get to this idea of kind of the importance that contact sheets and this idea of like revisiting played. So another part of that, that context that I was talking about of this space of zines was the first place where I really made use of this idea of returning to the contact sheet as an important part of the work, that I'd kind of realized that, that making the work, processing the film, making contact sheets, making a selection, that first image, that I was always finding myself reinvigorated by returning to sort of the source material at different points and realizing I would connect with different images. I incorporated contact sheets into the first zines that I made. This is the first issue of the zine called Shoot that had 7 issues from 2005 to 2007 or 8 with Nico here. This is the cover. And here's an excerpt from the third Shoot zine, which was called Frank, and it was made in collaboration with a friend and writer named Ido Fluke. And you can see, I'm using this sort of traditional sort of like laser print Xerox way of translating the zines from, the hand printed and arranged material into this photocopy, into the zines. But again, the thinking through them is each zine in a sense was kind of like a working through of the contact sheet. I want to show some more contact sheets. One particular one from Nicholas Boston, who actually wrote a brief profile. It was the first bit of writing that that appeared in Butt magazine for me. And so this is a portrait that I made while he sat kind of recording our conversation that he would then transcribe and edit into that first feature. Here's some of those contact sheets. It's been really interesting to sort of see these over time. But again, you can start to see a little bit of my selections here and here. But the reason why, it's not usual for an artist to show their contact sheets in the context of like an artist talk, but the thing that I kind of want to, again, emphasize with these is that there has been this way, like kind of like recursive thing that I've been interested in since the very early work of like I said, always sort of like returning to the source and being able to reorder, resequence, recontextualize photographs. Here's Jay from 2008. And you'll sort of, maybe I'll jump ahead to sort of see where this starts. Well, now you kind of see in this work, Michael Dialogue from 2006, and an excerpt from this is also in the show there at Alice Austen House, how I start kind of using this, because I started making these works loosely called dialogues around 2006. And so I would, you know, in the course of a sitting for a portrait like here with Michael in my bedroom, we'd be often having a conversation or just, you know, well, yeah, usually it's a conversation because then everything becomes, you know, people loosen up and, you know, the sitting is much more natural. But I began thinking about the difference between the selected image, like the idea of making a selection to a final image that's supposed to sort of sum something up, or looking at the entirety of the images taken and this possibility of sequencing and resequencing them in order to produce different kind of sum total emotional or other kinds of feeling. I hope that starts to make sense. So what this is, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 frames of what would have been like a roll of, you know, one medium format roll of film with 10 frames, that each one is printed. And the idea, even though I only got to show this once in this show in Red Hook, that each time I would put it up, I might resequence which ones are on the shelf and which ones are left out, that there would sort of be a different kind of like progression to this conversation that's happening with Michael. Here's some of the initial images, or I mean, sorry, some of the individual images so you can see them more up close. But again, yeah, this is how the, you know, from thinking through the zine, and which becomes a fixed sequence but less precious, into thinking about using the contact sheet and what unfolds over the sitting as a way, as kind of a larger context. Something that was also, I think, informing this was that, you know, as work went out into the world in these like online and social media and in zines and all this stuff, there was a sense that like my initial idea that like photography could like nail down meaning, particularly as it related to friendships and relationships, that because of just the inherent, you know, nature of what happens through dissemination of images and the way they come back to the author or to the subjects, it was, you know, that became the way they became carriers of and actually affected friendships and the social space, like within an economy of portraiture, became much more of the interest than the idea that, let's say, this portrait of Michael would be the defining one. You know, this sitting here, I believe, was the second portrait sitting that I had done with Michael. The first ones were from 2005. And also I should say, you know, like these are all of these friends here are dear friends to this day. And I would, you know, I couldn't have any, well, yeah, when you're really young, like I don't think you anticipate how long friendships will last. Here's a portrait of Amy from another one of these dialogues. Again, another one of, you know, my closest and dearest friends. You know, we met in our freshman year dorm in NYU and became, you know, at this point in 2006, we were roommates, and she sat for many portraits over the years. And again, just kind of like thinking, you know, there's this way in which like, for many of these, I resisted kind of finishing them. And so the images as they exist as like what was shot in the sitting becomes, in a sense, the work. It's also interesting because, you know, it's talks like these when I'm able to, you know, like a lot of this work was made, how do you say, like, speculatively. You know, it's like you make a lot of work when you're younger and it's like you don't have opportunities to show this work, like it sits in boxes, you know. So I had ideas of how this work would be presented. It's kind of formed more conceptually after the fact, but I haven't ever actually had the chance to, let's say, show all of these. There's not only with Amy and Mike, but there's like many of these dialogues, so to speak, of looking through things. Here's a portrait from later on in 2009. Yeah, it's just so much fun to look through these over time. And then here's a portrait of Joshua, April 2006. These ones, how do I describe these? These are marked by the month April of 2006 for a particular reason. I think this was a moment in a particular friendship where I realized I was using portraiture or using the making of photographs again, kind of like trying to forget what I had started to understand, that like the making of photographs didn't solve anything. It just produced another object to be contended with, or the fact that like you can't use the making of in a way, you know, maybe a funny way to put it is like, and I hope this doesn't sound crazy, but like when people are like, let's have a baby to solve the relationship, like sometimes making of artwork kind of functions as like having a baby, like it's gonna hold you together. But it really, you know, and it's been interesting because Joshua and I have talked about this. He's a professor at RIT and actually invited me to do a talk for one of his classes last year. And we kind of like talked about this thing where, again, the production of portraiture produces so many things that can't be sort of contained. And I think this image, self-portrait holding Joshua's hand, really kind of like illustrates this attempt at like me making these images a way of holding on to and kind of like pinning down this you know, this very, you know, at the time, complicated friendship. And something that I had made from it, again, was this idea of returning to the contact sheet and putting together this triptych called the difference between a memory, a portrait, and a resolution. This is 1 of 3. This is 2 of 3, and this is 3 of 3. And these have only been shown once at Daniel Reich Gallery in 2006. In this really lovely group show. But anyways, that was this one of these pieces that took many, many years to resolve. But you start to see this idea of time developing, I think, also in this point in these works. And then this way in which like images start to respond to other ones. In a sense, these images made later on in 2006 were an attempt to recreate individually those first portraits made with Joshua. 2007, I think, I tend to remember, I think this was like after breaking up with someone in 2007, making, you know, and again, one of those like rare moments where I tried to actually make an image that was like a timestamp. And it's also funny that it was like April a year after. Oh my God, it's so crazy looking at old old pictures. Okay, but so let's move ahead again to expanding ideas of time. So the next set of images I'm going to show are of my friends Darren and Katie. And so these are some Polaroids from, these were probably the first or the second portraits I'd made with Darren. I kind of am happy that I found these scans of these like, well, they're not Polaroids, they're Fuji instant film prints. Fuji always had nicer instant film prints than Polaroid. But you know, again, these images with Darren, like he really, you know, alongside this long-lasting friendship in many ways becomes this way where I have to start really thinking through the idea of like what how a friendship leads to a portrait, how the ongoing making of portraits leads to ideas of like the muse, and how we just sort of like grow over time. Oops, sorry. You know, here, this image here is was made this is like 5 years after the first images. I had photographed him. He came up to my studio when I was at the residency at the Studio Museum in Harlem, and I had photographed him that summer in June. And then this image from September 8th of 2011 is me rephotographing a portrait of him from that previous June in this space. Again, this idea of time entering in with these little nods to the still life here behind it, we have a fragment of a portrait of my friend Joshua. And also we have these like nods to sort of like books and stuff like that. And this stuff starts, you know, gets further developed in time, but it's kind of, you know, I always like showing these examples because how like one subject and one relationship with a friend like moves across all of these projects. Like here's, you know, from a much more recent body of work, the Darkroom series. Here's, I just found these, this like double portrait. I would not have remembered this until I found it on a hard drive, but I remember this now, like Katie and I sitting down and just doing this test of just photographing each other. And I had the timestamp August 11th, 2005. I was actually looking for a portrait that I made of her and her now husband, but boyfriend at the time, Brett. I had made a double portrait of them in my room and I can't find that image, sadly, but I found this one from 2005. And then again, thinking over time, here is Katie at the sitting for me at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And then a more recent one, a portrait I made of her at 5 months pregnant with her daughter, which I love thinking of it as a triple portrait. And sorry, there's a helicopter going over. The LAPD go away. And then Victor here. Oops, I think this one is out of order. But I should also kind of keep an eye on time. Oh, sorry. I think I was, yeah, let's just skip this one because I realized I removed all the other ones. Okay, so thinking about kind of like that space of the bed, you know, these earliest works as like bedroom works, and the more recent work that I'm doing, thinking about like the dark room and its multiple meanings. I kind of want to start with a couple images from 2007. So, you know, like I mentioned before, as I'm photographing in this space, like the recurring background of my bed as a horizon line, that's interesting. Like when I started to line up the images, became like an actual horizon across, you know, any space that the work was hung. I started taking more interest in that, and actually this is where the first sort of still lives begin. Or like thinking about like images of the studio, where I started making photographs before and after a sitting. And I was also really interested in like the fact that I had this bookshelf here that was beside my bed, and you would kind of get a sense of what I was reading at any given moment. But also just like starting to think really about like fabric, you know, that an image like this portrait of Michael, there's a whole story sort of like behind this, that that this work, I'm really thinking about kind of like the landscape, I'm thinking about the horizon, I'm thinking about like that fabric as support. You know, these are Polaroids that I made of that, and I was just calling these bed landscapes, and I can't remember if these were made before or after that portrait of Michael, but thinking about that space and thinking about how fabric works. Here's another one. I hope you can see this one. You know, these ones are images that had never really been, I don't know if I ever did anything with these, but I would think it was maybe my first digital camera that I had, and I just started photographing my bed, and I became really interested in like black sheets, and just the way that they photographed. And so this is what I'm talking about when I started working with a lot of this material, but you know, it took a long time for me to think about how that might work conceptually. I think at one point I wanted to like formalize this more, but it was really hard. Like, and I think this is the next images we'll see, like, you know, with these portraits of Jake here, how, you know, that becomes the sort of like the landscape for his figure. And then these are the images of the space, either before or after him sitting. And then here's another one. I found it much more difficult. I think this is just a factor of like of shooting on film. with black sheets in a room with white walls is it was very hard to photograph analog and get that sort of like depth in there. But when you see work like that moves into the studio museum and further on, these piles of sheets are those sheets that were where everyone sat for the years before. So when I first start working with fabric, it really is just bringing in the bed sheets as they got old and worn, and kind of figuring them out in the space. Here we also have, this is my friend Jeffrey's boots. We have a fragment of a self-portrait from the prior December. This image here is a test print of Tony, which was actually, you catch a glimpse of it behind Katie in the prior picture. You know, so when I start these early arrangements with the black fabric, years before I start thinking about how they could be used to construct or work with the ideas of the construction of a backdrop, foreground, backdrop, space to be seen, interior spaces, social spaces, sexually playful spaces to be that might unfold behind them. Here again, just like really just like looking at that space. You know, and here we have pictures of the pictures. Again, it's like one of these like images of the space, but in here we have, I photographed those original sheets and pillows. These are that were made in my bedroom and then taking them to the studio and rephotographing them. And then this is a kind of a little bit of a standout, and I was trying to find more of these because the tripod figures so heavily in my current work. And I have this series of images made between 2011 and 2014 of tripods. And it would be, a lot of them were made when I was at this residency in Fire Island and then this other residency in Chicago. And I might have like set my tripod up to photograph something, you know, have my camera up, and then I would walk away and then I would like look at the tripod from a distance. And then I would like be very much just like fascinated by it. And then I'd take the camera off and then I'd just photograph the empty tripod, or in this case, the tripod becoming a stand for this fabric, this like sheet that had been dyed and I kind of carried with me and photographed over the years. But I just wanted to sort of put a nod to, before the tripod factors in the reflections in images, it had become something that I photographed almost like if you could have that a kind of, what is it, like out of body experience and sort of see yourself from a distance and look back and photograph yourself. That's kind of how I thought about these. And so then when you see, you know, the you know, more recent work with the black velvets, the black and brown velvets and satins and other things, like that's, you know, I actually couldn't find, I was looking for an image that I couldn't find, but formally it's like the exact same picture that I made 7 years prior at the Studio Museum. This is made in my studio in Los Angeles. And again, like thinking about this image in relation to the one that I showed before of the black fabric over the like IKEA stands, and the creation of interior and exterior space. And then again to these where it becomes really this idea of like entering into under the dark cloth into the dark room. And then, you know, where you kind of fully enters into that. So, okay, so I got more stuff to talk about, so I'll kind of keep going. Yeah, you get it. So thinking about like kind of collage and studio time kind of comes together. You know, I was thinking about how to draw those links. And so I kind of wanted to show this. I made this like artist book project with Tim Hull called The Accidental Egyptian and Occidental Arrangements that we made with like unpublished source material, outtakes. These are contact sheets of portraits of this guy, Avi, that I used to be friends with, that we first met. He was someone that I'm, you know, that straddles the line between non-portraits and portraits. And he sat for me several times, and I have these like outtakes, and we used them, Tim and I used them in this way. First, you know, I was Xeroxing and scanning things and combining with these images that Tim had been collecting from his travels and our kind of like interest in the way in which the ways in which kind of like ambiguity and time and kind of like a playful sense of like pop appropriation kind of, I mean, this is a whole other conversation, just like aspects of, you know, things we think about as friends. But this is the first time that collage enters into the work. So when you start seeing stuff later on, like the seeds are kind of planted here that really grew out of like working with Tim, who was already thinking about kind of cutting and collage and whatever. So we just made these really fun things out of a mashup of the both of our images here. So I'm going to go over that pretty quick. I can come back to this stuff in questions if you'd like. Yeah, it was really fun. This was published as a book that we had printed, and I think there were maybe 1,000 copies of it. But something about that, you know, kind of kept me always returning, like unlocking that possibility of like collage, but also just the loose material kept me coming back to like what I found really exciting about the zines much earlier. And so between 2011 and 2014, after the Studio Museum residency and coming back to LA, I didn't have like a studio in New York. And so again, where kind of the collage really comes in is like my studio became these like what you're seeing here is me holding a bundle, like a binder clipped bundle printout of just like snapshots and things. This is a snapshot of images that were on the wall in my residency at the Studio Museum. Here's another set of things like these. This is the first time, again, I had a digital camera. I was photographing kind of out in the world, and my studio was these just like test printouts that I could arrange, binder clip, carry with me, unfold, you know, go over with friends, like, and there were these images that initially were just sort of documenting like how things looked together. And then later on, I thought of them as works. Like, so for example, this would have just been like me kind of noting what was in a bundle on November 21st. And this is when I had access to a friend's studio wall while he was away, and I unfurled this, photographed it, and then would put it back together. But the larger context of this is I had, you know, thousands upon thousands of images that were just these printouts. Some things might get organized in those arrangements. Many things, I just began to fall in love with the surface of them as they, like you can see here, like this work, Kitchen, Brooklyn, March 3rd, 2014. This is a 36 by 48 print. It's a high res, very sort of like textural scan of the surface of one of these laser printouts that has been scratched and smudged, and just by, you know, you can see where the clips were and how, and you know, it's where it had been folded and unfolded and how that kind of wears the surface and the touch. So like before you even get to this idea of like touch and trace on the surface of the mirrors, I was thinking like in the current darkroom work, I was thinking about it on the surface of all of this like unresolved material that just, again, some of it lived in these binder clip boxes, a lot of it, I mean, binder clipped bundles, and a lot of it lived in these bankers boxes, like just stacks and stacks and stacks of stuff. Here's another one where we can see, again, this is like a 16 by 20 print of a very detailed scan of laser print that had, where you can see the traces of its, like if I zoom in here, you can see, like I was very much interested in where it had been folded. So for all of this work, I never actually went back like to the original source raw files to print like pristine images. It was always about like what had accumulated on them as they lived their lives. So some of this stuff eventually found its way into this project called Some Recent Pictures, which is like, now there's like, I think 8 volumes of that bundled stuff that I occasionally would send off to a bookbinder in Brooklyn, and she would bind them. Here we can see 3 of them presented on a tabletop along with other loose material. That's a whole other project. I can get into that if you want, but the reason what's so important about these is, first off, the kind of like unresolved nature of just these accumulations of images, kind of like realizing there was something really beautiful about like the traces on the surface, as the papers were worn and held. And then again, like me photographing and rephotographing them, and it starts to develop this idea of collage. But again, they're only collages in the sense of like they're timestamps of things. So like this is, we see a obscured profile portrait of Enoch, this friend that I met in Chicago. And this is a little timestamp of April 2nd, 2014. So when it comes to the mirror, the work that people start seeing on the mirrors, like this is like a little unpublished outtake of like one of those first tests where a lot of the stuff that kind of comes together, right? So it's like, rather than thinking about the single image or the single portrait as being able to be to summarize or hold meaning, but thinking about how multiple images could work together, thinking about like how the bedroom became like this recurring backdrop to these figures that came into it. And then kind of a desire for me to kind of be implicated in all the images led to me getting these mirrors when I was in grad school and putting them in my studio. So this is a mirror. I believe it's maybe 24 by 36 or something, propped up against the chair in my studio. These are things just kind of taped to it. We catch a glimpse of my arm in the reflection as I'm photographing. Here, this is a reflection of things that are on the wall behind me. These are things in non-reflected space behind the mirror. You kind of start to see that, right? Eventually, many steps along the way, it leads to these much more formal, like, you know, I figured that I totally aestheticized them, like figuring out this way of these first studies that then later become like the mirror studies. So here we have these fragments, and when you see these fragments, like all of this stuff, this is from that same well of material, some recent pictures that had been accumulating for those 3 prior years and kind of is still ongoing. So when you see, like, this is another work that's in the show, Study for TH with 2 figures, you know, what this is like, this material is like unresolved fragments of a portrait of my friend Theodore. And it was, you know, I'd photographed him in my friend Shabad's apartment in her loft at the time. These are fragments of that. The 2 other figures, this is a tiny sliver of another friend, Joey, here, you know, and then the other figure is Shabad herself. But these become like, again, that way of like, it's not quite the thing of returning to the contact sheet, and it's a little bit of that, and it's a little bit of that idea of like making a photograph can affix meaning, even if for just a moment, that I would sort of like, these were made at a distance from friendship. So I had left New York quite abruptly, and just before Theodore and I had been seeing each other, and I left New York and I was like, I'm going to grad school, you know? And so a lot of this stuff was made in the distance of kind of like trying to, as kind of like a form of call and response, if that makes sense. So that's what I'm talking about, of like this idea of like, oh, maybe making the image will help put like, you know, like tie up everything on these. And so this is what's kind of happening in these: Study for Friendship, DCS and FC. Again, these are the initials. Here, David Christopher Suarez and Felix Cyprian. And you sort of see how like this image was made pretty soon after this image, because some fragments still remain on the surface of the mirror as things shift. And then of course, it's quite a big jump to get to these mirror studies, but all I'm going to say about it is that like the basic formal principle of how they're constructed is the same. I just moved from using this like backlog of unresolved material to making new images for the purpose of this process of cutting and arranging, so that they would be cut or torn, and they would have these irregular rather than each printed page. And Paul, were you gonna, I saw you were about to jump in.
Oh, no, I was just going to kind of give you, we're kind of like at 7:55 if we want to leave a little space for questions. But I think you're like, I love how we've gotten up to this point and really seen like the evolution of sort of like working from this like deep well of pictures that you've made. And is there a part of this that you want to wrap up and then take some questions?
Yeah, and I'm good for I'm good for however many questions. I'll try to wrap up in like the next 5 minutes or so. I think I just have
That
like
sounds great. That sounds great. And please think of questions, everyone, in the chat, and we could, well, you know, if anyone wants to turn on their screen, I'd love to see people and, you know, get some questions ready.
Okay, great. Yeah, so mirror studies, that's where all this stuff kind of comes from. So like, you know, if you get it, I hope everyone gets like, oh, actually, you know what, this is the last image, so we were right on. So I was gonna say, like, so I hope like, as you know, as you go through the show, if you get a chance to see it, like taking note on all of the little details in the works, not only the, you know, the central subjects of the portraits per se, but like, you know, this, you know, work like this is also very indicative of the ways in which what's happening on the edges and the perimeter of the images formally, how important that is in terms of like suggesting what's just off frame, thinking about like in the portraits in the show, you know, what is leaving or entering into the frame of the works. And things like this, again, how these fabrics are, you know, come from those first bed sheets on which everyone sat, how like the smudges and the traces here come from like living and working with those that project, Some Recent Pictures, and kind of like really thinking about what accumulated on the surface of those prints. And you know, here it's the mirror. How this sort of like the idea of this tripod that you see comes from thinking about looking at oneself from a distance, but also becoming like a formal anchor for the work. And then, you know, when you see things like this, thinking about like how, you know, Victor here appears over, you know, 4 different bodies of work and, you know, a good 12 or 13 or, oh gosh, 13 or 14 years of time. So yeah, we'll leave it here. Maybe I'll go back to one of the works that's in the show, and we can, do you have any questions, Paul? Getting started, or?
Well, I'm just going to share in the chat. There's like a virtual version of the show that people could check out. I'm actually staring at this picture right now. It's right across from me.